First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 land. On Turtle Island, this is the traditional territory of the home of the Cree, Anishinaabe, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. First, I'd like to thank the program committee chairs of Adina and Marion for asking me to moderate tonight. Appreciate that. And accepting this assignment, I pondered why this panel discussion is an important and critical discussion in these current times. A number of questions came to mind. Have we been infuriated with the horrors of Charlottesville and Trump's reluctance to condemn white nationalists and blaming the violence on both sides and saying that some very fine people can be found on the far right? Also, let's not forget Canada, because we're not immune to this, and our experience of the Quebec mosque attack and the September event where white supremacist groups declared they would march in front of our provincial legislature. Another question, are we ready to hear the voices of the alt-right? Or should we be insulated from that critique and debate? What about our beliefs of free speech, and how far will we let that concept tell us who we should hear from and who we should not hear from? When we hear the words far right, alt-right, within the organized groups, their beliefs and behaviors, do we automatically go to the place to demonize them, feel threatened and disempowered? On a more personal level of question is, how much are we willing to understand the context of why people have identified themselves as alt-right? And are we willing to enter into conversations to hear and grapple with the why by way of a one-to-one conversation of personal discovery and learning? I'm sure that there'll be many questions we're going to be thinking about tonight as we hear from our esteemed panel members. In that regard, I'd like to receive your permission to suggest the following process. We will hear from the panel members. Dr. Fliss Feder will start first and establish the context, 20 minutes to do that. Dr. Ahmed would follow with 15 minutes, and Dr. Mills would follow with another 15 minutes. Then we'll open this to questions from the audience, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes, then close with some appreciations, and then we'll have beverages in the auditorium. Right? Still do beverages? Got it. Okay. Refreshments. Right. No food, just refreshments.
No, that's good. Fine.
Okay,
Go on.
just making sure. So let me introduce the panelists. Let's go there. So Matthew Fliss-Feder is an assistant professor of rhetoric. To tell me what that actually means. Rhetoric and communications at the University of Winnipeg. His research addresses questions about the intersection of media, ideology, and subjectivity. He was the co-editor of CIGEC and Media Studies, a reader, and specifically his article was on Trump, What Does the Name Signify, or Proto-Fascism and the Alt-Right. Definitely like to hear about that. Kausar Ahmed has received his PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Manitoba. He served in the United Nations as a peacekeeper and is an alumnus of the National Defense University in the US. And currently he's a research fellow with the Center of Defense and Security Studies and a junior research affiliate with the Canadian Network for the Study of Terrorism, Security, and Society. Currently he is working on a book with 2 US-based academics in exploring roles of community-based organization in countering violent extremism in Western societies. Alan Mills is a full professor at the University of Winnipeg in the Department of Political Science. He was the chair of the department from 2000 to 2005 and 2014 to 2016. He has published articles on Canadian socialism, the Canadian Forum, early Winnipeg radicalism, J.S. Woodsworth, Frank Scott, Ernest Gellner, and media in the post-communist Czechoslovakia. We have an esteemed panelist for us to enjoy tonight, so I'm going to call on Dr. Fliss-Feder first to help us set the context, and then we'll have Dr. Ahmed follow, and then Dr. Mills. Thank you.
It's good to do the score in the Jets game. I'm coming from Toronto, so I always have my little app just to see not the Leafs, God forbid the Leafs, but the Jays I'm following now. So Thank you very much. I want to thank, first of all, Adina for inviting me to come and speak on this panel. I want to thank Martin for that introduction, and to my co-panelists. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have. I want to say that, first of all, what I'm going to speak out, this is based on an article that I have coming out, should be in the next month or so. Martin mentioned it. Trump, what does the name signify? Or proto-fascism and the alt-right. By way of trying to explain some context and background about the alt-right, I want to discuss mainly the ideology and the culture of the alt-right, and try to explain it that way. My background is mostly in culture and media studies, so that's the kind of perspective that I'm going to bring to my reading of the alt-right. And I want to begin by saying that the way I think we need to contextualize the alt-right, there's three issues that I would think are worth discussing. One is the very recent history of the 2008 financial crisis. I think that's an important moment for thinking about the rise of what we now call the alt-right. The other one is what I would refer to, and I speak as somebody from the left, as the failure of the left in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And then the third element that I want to spend most of my time talking about are what I think of as contradictions of what's been called the postmodern culture, talking about contradictions of subversion and transgression within what's called the postmodern culture. I'm going to spend some time explaining that. But first I want to define how I'm using the term proto-fascism as it relates to the alt-right. And there are four main elements that I want to speak to about how to define proto-fascism. The first is that you can define proto-fascism in terms of its culture and its ideology as a reaction to the perceived ideological threat of a left or anti-capitalist movement. Second, its elaboration as an ideology is formed by the discrediting of the various hegemonic ideologies of the liberal middle class, such as tolerance, equality, and identity. The third is that because of the inconsistency between the first element of discrediting the left or anti-capitalist movement and inconsistent with the discrediting of the liberal middle class ideology, this opens up a space to displace the critique of capitalism, replacing it with features of culture. And the fourth element is that these various free-floating elements are embodied in a mass ideological party which can stand as a figure for new collectivity and a vehicle for the seizure of state power. So to define the term alt-right was initially used by members of its various groups to define a new wave of overtly white segregationist and white nationalist movements and subcultures, typified by spokespeople like Richard Spencer, president of the white nationalist think tank National Policy Institute, who has called for a U.S. white ethno-state and a pan-national white empire. The alt-right is characterized by its preoccupation with IQ, European demographic and civilizational decline, cultural decadence, cultural Marxism, anti-egalitarianism, and Islamification. The alt-right should be distinguished from the brand of American neoconservatism tied to the support of the George W. Bush regime, which as a political force emerged from a convergence of interests including evangelical Christianity, secular cold warriors, and conservative feminists and family moralists. What binds these seemingly disparate groups under the rubric of neoconservatism is their affirmation for a moralist state power both domestically and internationally. Neoconservatism therefore imputes to the state the authority to set the moral religious compass of society. The alt-right is distinguished by its chiding of moral religious rightness. In fact, its blatant crassness is one of its most identifiable features. Much of the popularity of the alt-right and the attention that it has received in the mainstream mass media has been due in part to its combination of crude humor and youthfulness, and because of its image-based culture of online meme production in online chat forums like 4chan and 8chan. Traditional conservatives have taken notice of the alt-right because of its vocal opposition to left forces such as political correctness, feminism, and multiculturalism. The alt-right and traditional conservatives have thus found an alliance in challenging what they see as a left penchant for oppressing free speech, which the alt-right and conservatives see as a product of feminism and so-called cultural Marxism's push for political correctness, and they collectively refer to these groups as social justice warriors or SJWs. What makes the alt-right such an oddly fascinating yet no less concerning movement is that it seems to use cynicism and irony in staging and borrowing language and tactics from the New Left of the 1960s. At a very formal level, it seems to promote itself as a radical alternative movement against what it positions as the dominant ruling ideology. It is a reactionary movement against the liberal center. However, it is a pseudo-emancipatory movement that targets culture and different cultural identities instead of the political economy of capitalism and its class relations as the source of today's problems. Culture, rather than the political economy of capitalism, is for the alt-right the real problem. The alt-right is capable of organizing dissent by recognizing people's authentic frustration with the status quo, but rather than address the core of the problem, and I would argue that in terms of the relations of exploitation with capitalism, it displaces this problem onto a false problem. Usually for right-wing populism, this means blaming some kind of false image of an enemy or intruder who disrupted the system from within, such as the anti-Semitic representation of Jews and Jewish people in Nazi Germany. From the perspective of the right, the problem is not the system itself, but the cultural enemy or intruder who disrupted the system. Today, for the alt-right, this enemy has multiple identities. On the one hand, it is formed through standard practices of racism and sexism. On the other hand, the alt-right has targeted particularly politicized groups such as feminism. So feminism as opposed to just to women. The alt-right is largely masculinist and anti-feminist, concerned with the decline of Western masculinity, and therefore feminism has been one of its chief targets. By targeting politicized groups rather than individuals based simply on race or gender, an appearance is created whereby left political movements are figured as the ruling elite. That is, it makes it look like feminism is a dominant ideology, despite the continued existence of systemic and physical violence against women, which reproduces existing forms of inequality. Going after feminism in this way reinforces patriarchal domination as a social, cultural, and political institution. But still, because it is posited as transgressive and subversive, the alt-right is tactical in displacing blame for existing economic problems and cultural conflicts onto liberal and left agents. Viewing them in this way, I claim that the alt-right is a symptom of what I'm going to now define as postmodern late capitalism. It is a reactionary formation that can only be understood at a formal level in the emergence of postmodern culture. The alt-right is on the one hand a byproduct of ideological postmodernism, and on the other hand the result of the contradictions of subversion and transgression within the postmodern culture. So to understand this, it's necessary to first recall in what sense subversion itself became part of the postmodern culture. This is a development that is tied to the very persistence of capitalism to break down all barriers to accumulation. It tries to eliminate whatever will get in the way of its process of accumulating profit and wealth. This includes, in some cases, the breaking down of political and cultural barriers. Politically, this has resulted in the incorporation of existing antagonisms into the very logic of capitalism, where class war has turned into the so-called culture war. This last point helps in part to explain the rising influence of the moral majority and neoconservatism among the working classes in the United States from the late 1970s up to and including the George W. Bush presidency. With the transformation of class war into culture war, it often appeared as though the right, more than the liberal left, spoke the language of the working class. As a logic of production, capitalism is also driven by its push towards development, constantly in need of destroying the old to produce the new. As such, it consistently requires the breaking down of those older ideological barriers that prevent exponential expansion. The historical period that we call modernity was therefore culturally contradictory in the sense that, for instance, it relied on traditional culture, say the culture of the conjugal patriarchal family, as part of its own process of social reproduction, while working to break down the structures of traditional culture to produce new agents that could go out and consume. I want to draw a parallel here between this logic and similar operations that happened within modern art and culture. So bear with me here, we're going to go into some art criticism. The commodification of art and culture is a contributing factor for the emergence of modernism as an art movement. Modern art emerged by seeking to distance itself from what was later termed mass or popular culture. Also, modern art came about through practices of negating the influence of new media, beginning with photography. The technological reproducibility of the image instituted in modernism a formal criterion to, quote-unquote, make it new. From Impressionism onwards, through Cubism, Surrealism, and Abstract Expressionism, visual art sought to distance itself formally from the production of verisimilitude found in popular culture. On the other hand, the modern avant-garde found definition by distancing itself from the culture of the bourgeoisie. Culturally, modern artists carved out a space for themselves by setting up a concept of the bourgeoisie to demonstrate precisely what they were not. At the same time, modern artists sought to distance their work from the political sphere completely, hence the tautology, art for art's sake. So it is in these two ways that modernism found definition, by railing against what it was not, both in terms of its object, the work of art itself, as a non-commodity, and the identity of the artist as being anti-bourgeois. However, capitalism, being what it is, did not take very long to saturate this antagonism. While modernism may be understood by its vocation to not be commodity, postmodernism now, we could say, is what emerges at the point of total commodification in a post-war consumer society, where art and commodity begin to fold into each other, as in the case of something like Andy Warhol and pop art, right? Where it's the Campbell's soup can, for instance, it's the advertisement that's now the commodity. But postmodernism is also what emerges when the rebellious art of modernism, which constantly sought to negate the existing world formally, becomes the official art of the canon, the gallery, and the university. Or put differently, and this is one of my central claims, I want to emphasize this, if modernism defined itself as a process of subversion and negation, postmodernism culturally is what emerges when subversion itself becomes the dominant ideology. If subversion is now part of the ruling ideology, how might we imagine the subversion of subversion? Alongside these developments in the cultural sphere, a parallel conundrum emerged in the political spheres of Western Europe and North America in the 1960s in the moment of the post-war welfare state and the Cold War era class compromise between capital and labor. In place of the class struggle between capital and labor, new social movements, or NSMs, from the civil rights movement and the post-colonial movements to second-wave feminism, the gay liberation movement, and the student and anti-war movements arrived on the scene. But just as modern art and culture were absorbed into the mainstream, first by the logic of commodification and then by way of institutionalization, so were the new social movements similarly diffused. With the campus protest culture of the 1960s and 1970s, new social movements began to have a profound impact on the curriculum of humanities departments at the university, with more attention being paid to non-white and female scholars, writers, and artists, launching a kind of academic culture war. The culture war in the university drew attention to issues of cultural representation in media, the stereotypical representation of racialized and gendered minorities, which by the 1990s came to include the representation of gays and lesbians with the addition of queer theory to the literature. Not surprisingly and not unproblematically, the rising attention to cultural representation and questions of diversity in the media was picked up by the consumer culture. Just as the threat of subculture, for instance, is diffused by incorporating it through commodification, so have the identity politics of the new social movements and the institutionalization of the culture wars been incorporated into the branding logic of the consumer society, which is interested less in multiculturalism and diversity or intersectionality than with maintaining a steady base of diverse consumers in order to avoid a crisis of market demand. Here too, then, rebelliousness, difference, and subversion have become part of the reigning ideology when it comes to questions of identity and difference. We see here a commercial diffusion of subversion. Rather than ideology attracting individuals as compliant subjects, the ruling ideology today is grounded on an inherent transgression of the ideology that seems to rule. Here we face one of the central cultural and political contradictions of our time. In both art and culture, and in the identity politics of the new social movements, subversion, far from being antagonistic to the existing system, has actually become the dominant ideology. If this is the case, what does subversion of subversion look like? This is how the situation has to be approached from the perspective of looking at the new alt-right. What the left sees as a subversion of bourgeois or elitist or phallocentric or Eurocentric ideology, the alt-right sees as the formation of a new culturally dominant ideology best encapsulated in the much disdained call for political correctness. The alt-right, too, is anti-bourgeois. And I don't know if people have seen it, but it's worth looking at. There was an interview yesterday that came out with Steve Bannon in The Spectator, where in much of his interview, and he's expressing, he's saying he's not a fascist, but he's expressing an interest in Mussolini And he talks about his interest in Mussolini, talking largely in kind of oddly anti-capitalist terms. He's against authoritarian state capitalism, he's against financial capitalism. So it's an odd formation where the alt-right now too is starting to speak in terms of anti-bourgeois rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, by the way. But perceives and constructs the left, the alt-right does this, but it perceives and constructs the left as just such a bourgeoisie, just such a ruling class, trapped in its own libertine elitist bubble. What the alt-right, particularly in its white nationalist and masculinist bent, finds most objectionable in the politically correct postmodern identity politics is what its members perceive as a double standard on questions of diversity and identity. From their perspective of the alt-right, all identities are permissible save for white and conservative or even normative identities. In this scenario, when political correctness and postmodern identity politics are posited as the ideology that seems to rule for the alt-right, its politics cannot but appear as subversive. The alt-right, in fact, is caught up in the postmodern call to subversion. What makes this formation additionally troubling is that it also at times seems to rail against the consumer culture of postmodern capitalism, making it both ironically populist and at times seemingly anti-capitalist. In contrast, recall that we did see a wave of left protest movements after the 2008 financial crisis, from the so-called Arab Spring to the Occupy Wall Street movement. What was significant about the former is that it shows that how the strength of the people can be a force of change. The Occupy movement, in addition, drew significance for directing attention to the capital class dynamic. However, these movements failed to produce any kind of lasting alternative to the existing system. Occupy Wall Street was famously mocked for being leaderless and for lacking concrete demands, and therefore reflected the impotence of the left. Once again, the left was incapable of producing change. There have been different material dimensions to each new rise of the right in recent years, whether it's Trumpism, or the Brexit vote, or even the new alt-right. But in many ways, they are all reactionary responses to the failure of the left in the wake of the crisis. Phenomena like the rise of the alt-right demonstrate quite clearly that, quote, every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution. This phrase, which the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek often attributes to the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin, signals what is perhaps the most depressing aspect of the rise of the alt-right as a proto-fascist movement. It highlights the fact that there was a revolutionary potential, a dissatisfaction which the left was not able to mobilize, or in fact that the revolutionary potential of the left failed by being beaten out by the predominant liberal status quo. There are then two ways to understand the failure of the left in the wake of the 2008 crisis of capitalism. One, as a failure of mobilization, and two, as a failure to break through and defeat the liberal ruling class. I think here the example of, you can even put in the context of the challenge between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, if you want to put a face to it there. The first problem is one of building up left as a hegemonic force. In some ways, the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street did demonstrate a wave of post-crisis leftist enlightenment, which saw rising popularity of left-wing political parties, such as Syriza in Greece, as well as avowed socialist figures like Bernie Sanders in the United States and Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. But Syriza's inability to defeat the European Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund in its austerity talks, the pro-Brexit vote in the UK, and Sanders' failure to secure the nomination of the Democratic Party's candidate for president all show signs of a defeat for a left that rose up only to be beaten back down, not by the alt-right, but in fact primarily by the liberal status quo. Therefore, according to Žižek again, the liberal ruling class and the fascistic reaction are two sides of the same coin. Herein lies the difficulty with the alt-right. They distance themselves from their position via the appearance of rational discourse and critical interpretation. When one listens to speeches given by Richard Spencer, as deplorable as his arguments sound, these appear not to be the ravings of a madman, but the carefully thought out and charismatic pseudo-intellectual statements of a quote-unquote leader. The movement, in other words, produces organic intellectuals. But in its populist form, the movement clings to the other and culture as fetish, disavowing the centrality of the class struggle, using the other, such as feminists, cultural Marxists, SJWs, and so forth, to displace this centrality. Therefore, rather than try to conceive members of the alt-right to convince members of the alt-right through rational critical interpretation that their rage is simply displaced, they should be seen more as a reactionary formation, the symptom a symptomal product of the defeat of the left by the liberal ruling class. It's for this reason that if the alt-right is to be defeated, the challenge is to defeat the liberal ruling class itself. As Zizek puts it, for the left, the only true alternative is the one between itself and the liberal mainstream, the populist radical right being nothing but the symptom of liberalism's inability to deal with the leftist threat. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me today, this evening, both the organizers and the moderator. It's my privilege to talk to you. This is about my research, very recent research that I have undertaken to understand the community-focused projects in terms of countering radicalism in Western societies. So this project is in a very last stage. We submitted, and it's going to be out by September, fall, by Lexington Books. So what really, brought me to these whole phenomenon of alt-right, that's what I wanted to share with you this evening. So in last July, by the way, I work for Manitoba Justice, so I have some understanding of the safety and security of the province. So from that perspective, we received a couple of incidences report that there were a number of graffitis in downtown couple of buildings, government buildings. It was pretty bizarre for us because it doesn't happen always. So when they sent me the photographs, I found with my bewilderment that these are anti-Semitic graffitis. So we investigated this whole thing through our professional channel, and we couldn't get to the sources because there were no CCTVs and other stuff. But I was very much interested to see the symbolism of these graffitis and what they wanted to say, and really wanted to say something about this whole issue. The second incident I was particularly witness to is it happened in last October in Legislature building. There was a rally, it's called Diversity Rally, if some of you might have heard, that was organized by Anti-Fa movement and with the collaboration of a Muslim group, China Siddiqui's group. So on that, gathering, I encountered 3 soldiers of Odin's members, and I had a long discussion with them. Interestingly, they wanted to talk to me too. So they had different ideas. So these 2 things, and finally, when I was writing a couple of chapters of my book, I was desperately looking to interview at least 1 or 2 alt-right groups in North America. And after a lot of persuasion, I could really end up with Life After Hate group, if you have some ideas. So they are based out of US, but they have organization in British Columbia. So these 3 things really brought me or gave me some idea about this upcoming movement. Formally speaking, I prepared a note, and I will try to stick to it. And I do apologize in advance if you find my ideas a little wandering. I would like to start today with a result of Pew's Global Survey, which was released in December 16. So according to that survey report, a majority, that means 54% of the United States adults say they have heard nothing at all about the alt-right movement. And another 28% have heard only a little about it, and just 70% say they have heard a lot about the movement. So that is the context. It is a very new phenomenon according to that Pew survey, and of course according to my own research. Southern Poverty Law Center, a little US-based think tank, they originally, they have a lot of data on alt-right supporters and movement in North America especially. According to their website and their definition, they define this movement or this group of people, those who have a set of far-right ideologies, and their core belief is that white identity is under attack by multicultural forces using political correctness, social justice to undermine white people and their civilization. Another expert termed it as a European-style alternative to mainstream American conservatism. However, in my own research, I find it is really grounded on 5 pre-existing strands. First off is paleoconservatism, which is characterized by nationalism, protectionism, isolationism. Number 2 is neo-reaction, which rejects outright many of the presuppositions of enlightenment. Third is Gamergate, an internet-based movement. Fourth is men's right, a movement dedicated to either undoing feminism or doing for men what feminism does for women. And the last one is white nationalism. I also checked up, and I do follow a couple of the websites and blogs just to see how the discourse really emerges and evolves. And just very interesting that the Breitbart website says that the movement is young and creative people who are eager to commit secular heresies. They have become public enemy number 1 to Beltway conservatives. And this is what is interesting, that this group of young people. We have to go back to Richard Spencer anyways, and who coined the term alt-right in 2008. And he argues that this is not related to white supremacy, KKK or neo-Nazi, but goes on to assert that USA is an Anglo-Protestant country, meaning a white country. He termed the past radical transformation of the USA as the great erasure that was taking place in the white world since 60s. A blog which is called Vox Populi, they say, and I quote, "The alt-right is not defensive attitude and rejects the concept of noble and principled defeat. It is a forward-thinking philosophy of offense in every sense of that term." However, some call it a big tent movement, although its values and beliefs do not differ significantly from the more classic far-right nationalism. In sum, the alt-right envisioned itself as a political alternative to traditional mainstream conservatism. That is to say, the alt-right thought of itself ultimately as a political movement that would get people elected, move legislation, and do broadly the things one expects out of politics. In order to understand the new alt-right movement, we should really see how the right-wing extremist groups actually evolved in Canada. One of my research participants is Professor Barbara Perry, and who has the Canada Research Chair on Extremism, and also she is the president of International Hate Crime Group. And in her research, she shared with me, and she says that since 1920s, in fact the 20s marked the era in which KKK established its root in Canada, 1920s. And it appeared in Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Neo-Nazi skinheads also began to appear in the United States and Canada in the late 1970s and springing up in numerous urban settings. Canada continued to see a rise in neo-Nazi activities in the 90s, particularly around the skinhead music scene. The Heritage Front continued to grow in Toronto, Hammerskin groups made their presence known in Montreal, and Aryan nations gained momentum in Alberta, Saskatchewan. Entering the 21st century, the KKK, Church of the Creator, skinhead groups such as Aryan Guard, Blood and Honor have maintained their presence in Canada, staging rallies against anti-racist, disseminating xenophobic flyers, and engaging in array of violent and deadly activities. A German-based neo-Nazi nationalist and anti-Islam group, the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of West, in short, PEGIDA, protested in the streets of Montreal in 2015, sending the message to all Canadians that Muslims that they are not welcome. So these are the couple of things that actually we find in Canada. However, the current right movement clearly targets Muslims in Montreal as per the research of Dr. Perry, and Canada as well as has global ties that are more organized and vocal in generation. A reporter observed the following in the province of Quebec, and I just quote because it is interesting how the whole report has been framed. And the reporter says that scaling the nearby walls of the citadel, Atalante, Quebec unfurled a banner that read, "Terrorist to the death, Islam out." Atlante are guys that are a bit more extreme than us, said Katie Latulippe, who heads the Quebec chapter of Soldiers of Odin, a group that has proposed patrolling Quebec City neighborhoods popular with Muslims. Atlante, on the other hand, advocates openly for a renaissance of the Neo-French in Quebec. And of course, according to many scholars, Montreal is the hotbed of right-wing extremism within Canada, and some scholars and experts explain the causes of Quebec mosque attack for this social-political condition. Now I shall move to one of the questions, why people are drawn to this movement. In my recent study in exploring contribution of community projects to counter radicalism in Western societies, I observed that identity still remains as a potent element of discord and grievance, our rallying factor, our battle cry for the marginalized, and especially the youth. Consequently, the youth segment of the Western societies, I carried out this study in 8 Western nations, North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and UK, Scotland. So in those 8 societies, I found that the youth segment of the Western societies is the epicenter of identity-related struggle, and some political pundits term it as identitarianism, which is originated basically in France as a youth-oriented critique of multiculturalism and immigration. The term advocates racially homogeneous political communities, marking the new wave of ultranationalism by expanding beyond existing neo-Nazi subculture. For example, in Berlin, in Brandenburg Gate in late August 2015, a group of young protesters climbed atop the famous monument and unfurled a black banner with the words, "Secure borders, secure future." That is to say that this whole movement has a very strong anti-immigration notion and attitude. One of my research participants from Belgium, he is a professor, and he says that people are mobilizing anew around old grievances along ethnic, religious, racial, and cultural lines, demanding that their identities be acknowledged, appreciated, and accommodated by wider society. Suffering discrimination and marginalization from social, economic, and political opportunities, they are also demanding social justice, the way they see it. So why this movement today? They are not isolated. They are part of a historic process of social change, of struggles for cultural freedom, of new frontiers in the advance of human freedoms and democracy. Next, I want to attempt to answer the question, what is the big draw as opposed to leftist liberal views? The first speaker touched it in details. I will only touch upon a couple of points here. Let me explain why it initially appeared to be different from classic right-wing political activism. The German identitarian movement calls itself a patriotic movement and a mainstream counterweight to the old right, because right-wing groups are too dogmatic and extreme. Now going back to the question of liberal left, I find York University psychologist Jonathan Haidt's explanation quite interesting here, as he propounded that liberals and peoples of the left underpin their politics with moral concerns about harm and fairness. They are driven by the imperative to help the vulnerable and see justice done. Conservatives, on the other way, and people of the right value these things as well, but have several additional moral touchstones, such as loyalty, respect, and sanctity. They value in-group solidarity, defense to authority, and protection of purity in mind and body. To liberals, those sincerely held values could look a lot like xenophobia, authoritarianism, and puritanism. The final question that I want to address here is that what are the effects of the alt-right on society in general and specific groups in particular? So the obvious answer is the changing nature of political landscape, where election of leaders like Donald Trump and like-minded leaders have already occurred in Europe. In Canada, we also see popularity of Conservative Party candidate Kelly Leitch, who partly used the same rhetoric during the party's leadership campaign. Nonetheless, we also find emergence of activist groups like Antifa, in short, anti-fascist political landscape, meaning different groups are now being pitted against each other, and often they use violence. Let me remind you that President Trump coined a new term after the Charlottesville attack, alt-left, to refer primarily to Antifa and black-clad anti-fascists who rioted on Inauguration Day in DC at Berkeley shortly after. Otherwise, this kind of phenomenon is gaining popularity in Western societies. Steve Saylor, another proponent of this group, of this camp, whose pseudoscientific writing on race is popular among the alt-right, demonstrates this well. Saylor began claiming as early as 2000 that the route to success for the Republican Party was to take populist and nationalist positions, such as hard lines in immigration, identity politics, and economic protectionism. Now to the specific effect of such movement onto the minority group. And in March 16, Spencer invited former California State University Long Beach professor Kevin McDonald, the author of a trilogy purporting to show that Jews seek to undermine the host Christian societies in which they often live, to speak at an event titled Identity Politics. After that event, Spencer stopped just short of questioning the Holocaust, telling a Huffington Post reporter that if it, I quote, really happened, then of course it wasn't justified. If it happened differently, then what the story we have been told is, then I think that needs to be out, unquote. In Canada, we find the emergence of a group calling itself Alternative for Canada, in short, Alt4Can, which held its first party conference in an undisclosed location in October 27 last year. They are self-described European nationalists. One would find that alt-right in 3 places in Toronto, coming out of Proud Boys groups, on campuses associated with the free speech on campus movement, and on the fringes of anti-Muslim movement. The Proud Boys are Western chauvinists who think the West is the best. This is all I have to say, drawing from my current research. And most importantly, I strongly feel that we might be complacent in saying that we are not American, or things not happening in Canada as it happens in America or Europe. But the point I want to make this evening is that the society itself is changing, for good or bad. And how the institutions, democratic institutions, moral and valued institutions, really strong and resilient, would eventually make the difference whether these groups would gain their foot in the future. Once again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you as well for having values that allow you to come to this event rather than to stay at home and watch from the big jet. What I want to argue is that the kinds of ideas that are indigenous to the alt-right have existed for the last 100 years at least. But they have become more threatening lately because of intensifying stresses within the overall world order, within the order of Western civilization as well, and I think through the result of the accidental election of Trump in the United States. Let me let you in on a secret. I was born at the end of the Second World War. I suspect some of you were actually born before then. But anyway, my father in the British Navy throughout the Second World War, met my mother in Scotland in 1944. Roughly speaking, give or take a few months, I appeared 9 months later. Hitler had already been defeated, and within a few weeks of my birth, if I can put it that way, the atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the war in the Pacific had ended too. So I entered a world, rather, that of course becomes more and more familiar with me. I think as well, you can join me in a kind of quick journey through that world, because what I want to suggest is that the kind of world we live in gives us some way of explaining this interesting group of people. The general argument I want to make is that white supremacist nationalism of the alt-right kind is a nationalist phenomenon. And nationalism has been attempting to organize the populations of states roughly since the French Revolution in the late 15th century. The problem, of course, of nationalism is that it has really no clear way of understanding and incorporating diversity, difference, plurality, and so on. Hence arises then some of the problems of nationalism and so on. Now, is the alt-right surely a relatively small movement, an inconsequential movement? Is it worth our attention on this evening? Let me just point out to you that in the election of 1928 in Germany, the Nazi Party had an incredibly small popular vote. By 1932, it had around 38%, and of course it became the largest party, and of course Hitler was called upon to essentially form a government. And in some ways, the rest is history. But anyway, let me just try and walk you through what I think is the context of our world. I've already alluded to the fact that it's a world dominated by the presence of nuclear weapons. It's a world that's grown in terms of its population exponentially. What are we at now? 6 billion plus? Demographers say it won't level off till about 2050, and it will level off at around 8 billion. Ecologists argue that the carrying capacity of the world, the planet, is maybe 1 billion people. And I say there are way too many people in the world for the sustainability of the environment. It's a time of incredible technological change. We all know it intimately. We were all, in some senses, born into the age at least of radio and planes and railways, but since then have come cybernetics, the internet, there will be other kinds of things. It's a time of the end of empires, but the continuation and rising of other empires. It's a time of increasing globalization of capital and trade, and of course, perhaps as a result of all of these things, it is a time of incredible environmental degradation. Now, looking at things more locally, looking at, if you like, our Western development in these last 50, 60, 70 years, it's been politically, internationally at least, the time of the Cold War. Communism is defeated in 1989, roughly. The United States is left as the one standing hegemonic power, becomes the world policeman. But then there emerges a kind of, well, multipolarity, as it's called, particularly with the rise of China and Russia under Putin reorganizing itself to play some kind of hugely devilish role in the world. Now, within these sort of international envelopes, in our own societies, in, can I call it the West, these are of course hugely contentious categories, but let's just think about the West if we can. There has evolved, I think, a kind of, what do we want to call it, a liberal democratic order, in which I think success has been achieved in some respects around issues like the rule of law, the importance and effectiveness of representative democracy. There has been a period of growing wealth, albeit sometimes interrupted, often, of course, unequally distributed. But there emerged in the post-war world in the West, you remember, in some senses, the middle-class society. While that middle class has shrunk somewhat lately, there is a sense in which the middle class is still a very important social formation in Western society. Think of Manitoba, can't win elections provincially unless you win those suburban middle-class seats. Winnipeg. If there has been some kind of reform impulse in Western societies, it has been some form of social democracy. Locally, the NDP, Liberal Party on a good day. think a general trend as well that's very important to understand in Western society in the last 50 years is what the eminent philosopher Charles Taylor talks about as the sort of importance of personally developed identities. There's been a kind of liberation of, if you like, everybody's right to affirm whom they deeply believe themselves to be. This, of course, has meant that racial minorities have affirmed such an identity of importance. Women, particularly, as well. The rise of a post-war feminism. We are women, we have a special identity, we want to affirm ourselves. There are, I think, as well, just moving along, certain kinds of curiosities and anomalies of what I would call Western modernity. The relative decline of religion. This is contentious, I know. Charles Taylor, one of my favorite thinkers, he would argue that, in fact, religion has not disappeared, it's just taken different forms. I think, however, that there's a good case to be made for the relative decline of religion. What I think as well has happened because of the media and the technologies and their sort of over-determining presence in our society is that essentially media have come to replace reality. Or if you like, reality has become profoundly mediated by technology, by our communication. Can't understand Trump any other way. It is that essentially media have provided a kind of, I'm not sure this is the right pronunciation, but I'll try, a kind of simulacrum of reality. We don't see reality, we see what we think is reality as it comes through television, internet, social media, and so on. Other kinds of interesting trends lately has been the deindustrializing of the West through globalization. Industry has been offloaded to places like China, India, other parts of the world. I think they want to make the case for capitalism and kind of industrial capitalism is that in the last 30 years, massive middle classes have been created in China and India. Another interesting curiosity and anomaly, I think, of Western modernity is a kind of skeptical, subversive account of truth in the universities. What is loosely called, if you like, the triumph of a kind of postmodernism. This was in many ways a project undertaken by very, very radical and perhaps ostensibly left-wing thinkers. But it is then that essentially the claim was there is no knowable truth about anything. We can put it as simply as possible. Our realities are always constructed. They're always in some senses mediated. It is that there are no facts. E.H. Carr, the famous Marxist historian, said that facts are like sacks of potatoes. It depends upon what you put in them. And yet we discover, of course, living in a post-Trump world, knowing what the facts are is very, very important. There is, I think, as well as a kind of curiosity of our world, a kind of gathering cosmopolitanism, which sadly I think is sometimes rather tacky and superficial. It's the cosmopolitanism of lying on a beach in Thailand, thinking you've discovered the Orient. I think as well, just going back to that question, the rise of the importance of everyone's identities, there has been as well the incredible sexual revolution of the last 50 years. The invention of the contraceptive pill, its massive, the beginnings of its massive use in the 1960s, has essentially, to speak for myself, liberated sexuality from issues to do with creating children. Sex can be fun. Sex is a kind of expression. And of course, sexual identity of different kinds have become part of those multiplying identities that have come to exist in our society in the last 50 years or so. Now, just speaking very, very quickly to the issue of the alt-right, The way I see it, rather superficially I think, is that these are essentially young, white males. And they are experiencing a kind of relative decline of their status in the societies into which they've been born. They are white, yet there is, if you like, a growing rise of racial minorities, assertion of the identities of racial minorities in the United States. It is that they are male, and yet they are confronted by the rise of womanhood, put it that way. Now, I just thought, sitting on the stage then, in many ways, of course, it's the story, I mean, crass, of the life of Hitler. Born in a small town, you remember, Linz, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire towards the end of the 19th century. Son of a middling customs official. He has great aspirations. He goes to Vienna to somehow pursue a study in art. He meets the Vienna of multiplying identities, of multiracialism, of competing peoples, not just German speakers, but Czechs from Bohemia and Jewish Viennese people in the incredible flourishing of their economic and intellectual success at that time. Hitler, German-speaking, German nationalist, looks at Slavs as inferior, looks at Jews as inferior. Essentially he feels that their relative success is a kind of contravention of the normal, natural social order. Now it looks to me that, as with Hitler, that the alt-right is a society of angry young white men experiencing a kind of declining status. Their anger is deep and multiple. It is anti-elitist. It is highly nationalistic, populist, anti-cosmopolitan, white supremacist, homophobic. Shall I go on? Misogynist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, protectionist, isolationist, violent, and anti-democratic. A sort of conjury, a collection of antipathies. We might say that, look, you know, these are horrid thoughts and horrid ideas, but look, it's only the expression of a small group of people. Those Nazis in 1928 maybe getting 5% of the vote. But look, it is that with the election of Trump, it seems to me, what has happened is that that relative minority has become sort of incorporated in a kind of broad consensus within the Republican Party that allowed Trump to triumph, and which, of course, Trump believes he has to continue to service. Because we have to understand the alt-right's ideas as a kind of continuum that takes in more moderate Republicans. So if it is that, look, you know, there are some alt-righters that are deeply, deeply anti-black, it is that a large part of the Republican Party is still annoyed at the defeat of the South in the Civil War and continues to be essentially espousing a kind of silent segregation continuing in the American South. So if there is a kind of warning about the importance of the alt-right, it is then that allied with political leaders like Trump, its ideas can have some kind of salience and effectiveness. Now, I like to think that, as you remember in the beginning of the famous book, Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. If I've talked about perhaps the worst of times, potential dangers of the alt-right, it is, I think, as well that I have to say it may well be the best of times too, because I think the moderate centre is winning the battle in steads, but there's still some problems to go through. Thank you for your attention.